Hey everyone, welcome to WittCode, where in this video we're going to learn about the JavaScript this keyword, its value in object methods, functions, events, and also how it works with special methods such as call, apply, and bind. But so before we begin, what is this? Well, this is a keyword, not a variable, that refers to an object. However, the variable it refers to depends on how it is used. For example, this in a method is different than this in an event. By itself, though, this refers to the global object. In other words, when this is in the global scope, it refers to the global object. In JavaScript, the global object is the window object. So here, when we log this in the outermost scope, we can see the window object printed to the console over here. Also, in strict mode, this still refers to the global object. And we can place JavaScript in strict mode by adding use strict at the top of the page. So even though we're in strict mode by using this here, we can see this still refers to the window object. And now let's talk about this in an object method. So the this keyword in an object method refers to the object. So in this case, this right here refers to the person object. The person object has three properties: first name, last name, and print full name. Therefore, within the print full name method, we can access the first name and last name properties with the this keyword, because this refers to this object. And this object has the properties first name and last name. And now let's talk about this keyword in arrow functions. So arrow functions don't have their own binding to this. Instead, they inherit it from the parent scope. This means that arrow function expressions are best suited for non-method functions. And a non-method function is a function that doesn't belong to an object. And now let's just call this function. And we can see the window object printed here. And this is even in strict mode, so we still have strict mode activated. Even in strict mode, arrow functions will inherit from their parent scope. And the parent scope in this instance is the global object. And so as arrow functions inherit this from the parent scope, using them in methods or functions belonging to an object can cause unexpected results. And so here, print full name and print window are methods, so they're not non-methods, as they belong to this person object. However, now we've changed this to use an arrow function, and those don't have their own binding. So in this case, this.firstName and this.lastName will be undefined, as we can see here, as they refer to the global object, or this refers to the outer scope, which is the global object. We can say we type on a first name. Let's add a first name and a last name property to the window object and see what gets printed. And now this function here, print full name, will print this.firstName and this.lastName, which is global name and global last name of the outer scope because we're using an arrow function, and the var keyword here will attach these variables to the window object. And now let's talk about the this keyword in a function declaration. So function declarations start with the word function, similar to how variable declarations start with either var, let, or const. Within a function declaration, the this keyword refers to the global object. In a browser, the window is the global object. Currently right now this is logging undefined, and that is because we are in strict mode. We'll go over this in a second, but for now, when we're not in strict mode, we can see my function declaration. This inside it refers to the window object, or the global object. So once again, within a function declaration, this keyword refers to the global object, and in a browser, the window is the global object. And even in nested functions, this keyword still refers to the global window object. So we can see now we have a nested function within my function declaration. We're calling it here, which is called, we call my function declaration, and we log this. And what is printed is still this window object. And this type of binding is known as default binding. And default binding is what happens if we don't specify any other kind of binding. And now let's work with strict mode. So let's use strict at the top again. And JavaScript's strict mode does not allow default binding. And therefore, this inside a function declaration is undefined. So in this nested function, we can see this, when we're logging it, is printing undefined. And if we just print this in the outer scope, we still get my function declaration. And now let's talk about this in event handlers. So event handlers are JavaScript code that handles events such as user input, actions, browser actions, etc. And in event handlers, this refers to the HTML element that received the event. So we've now created an HTML button, which we can see here. And this right here, so this keyword, refers to the HTML element. So when we use an onClick, this button will receive the event, and so we can set its background color to red when we click it. And just real quick, we can use the style property to manipulate its CSS or its appearance. And now let's start talking about this and the bind method. So we can explicitly set the value of this by using some JavaScript methods. And one of these methods is bind. And the bind method returns a new function that when invoked, gets its this set to a specific value. A method such as bind is great for preserving this. For example, when you pass a method as an object to another function as a callback, this is lost. So here, this line right here, we are calling this print full name function of this person2 object after 2 seconds. So this is at 2000 milliseconds, which is 2 seconds. And so this method will call this function after this amount of time. However, the person's first and last name are not printed. We get the global ones here. Let me remove those real quick. And so what we get when we call this is undefined, even though we have this first name and this last name set right here. And this is because the set timeout function received the print full name method of person2 without the person2 object. And we could fix this by using the bind method. And now after 2 seconds, we can see the first name and last name are printed instead of undefined. And this is because using bind here binds this method to this person2 object. So this is preserved. Specifically what this bind method does is it is called on a function, so this function here in this case, and it takes an argument for this as the first argument. So this in this case will be person2. So when this is placed in, first name and last name will refer to this here, which is person2. So what it does, bind, is it then returns the method it was called on. So it will return this method with the new this context. And now let's talk about this and a call method. So another JavaScript method that can mess with the this value is call. And the call method does the exact same thing as the bind method, but it calls the function instead of returning the function. So here, the function was being returned. Call will just call the function. So now, instead of returning the function like bind did, call calls the function immediately. So in this case, we're setting this to be person 3. So when this print full name method is called on person 2, or this method here, this context will be person 3, and the first name and last name properties there are Greg and Soup. So what is printed is Greg Soup. And now also the bind and call method take extra parameters for functions with arguments. So now this method takes an age parameter, and we can pass in an age. So now we get Greg Soup and my age is 27, because we passed in this, which is an argument for this function, which is being called here. And now let's talk about a method that's very similar to call, which is called apply. So the apply method is the exact same as this call method here, except that it takes arguments as an array. So we can see we get the exact same thing printed here, or here, as we do here, except the arguments for this function is made with an array with apply and not an array with call. And now let's talk about this and classes. So when it comes to this and JavaScript classes, it is actually very similar to functions because classes are really functions under the hood. Within a class constructor, this is a regular object, meaning it will inherit all non-static methods. So here, this is an instance of the person class. And the property names of an instance of the person class are the non-static methods and constructor, which we can see are print age, print name, and constructor. So if we look in the console, we get constructor, print name, and print age. And non-static essentially means it belongs to an object, whereas a static method belongs to the class. And also the prototype here is the person class, and we can print this out by we get the prototype of this object or a person object, and then we access its constructor, and the name property gives us the name of the prototype, which is person, and we can see that printed out here. And now let's talk about this and derived classes. So when it comes to this and derived classes or subclasses, calling the keyword super creates a this binding within the constructor. So the super keyword calls the constructor of the super class. So if we call this in the derived class before calling super, we will get a reference error. So here you can see we're calling this .studying or accessing this before calling the super keyword, which refers to the super class, which here is person, as a student is a person. And when we create a new student and the constructor is called, as we're accessing this before calling the super class, we get a reference error. And that is because calling this super method here creates a this binding within the constructor. So as the student class is derived from the person class, we need to call the super method before calling this. So if we switch this line here to after super, we won't get any issues. And we can also see real quick how super calls the constructor of the super class because what's printed out also is all this, and we get student, and then the constructor and study methods, non-static ones, printed out when we call new student. But so that was my video on everything you want to know about this keyword in JavaScript. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Besides that, I want to thank you for liking and subscribing today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Have a good one.